Settle in, close your eyes, and let the centuries drift past as we journey through the remarkable story of the Teutonic Knights. Our tale begins in the dusty, blood-soaked streets of Acre during the Third Crusade in the year 1190. The Christian armies had laid siege to this vital port city in the Holy Land, and thousands of soldiers from across Europe had gathered under the blazing Middle Eastern sun. Among them were German crusaders who found themselves far from home, suffering from wounds, disease, and the harsh conditions of medieval warfare. Some merchants from the German cities of Bremen and Lübeck noticed their countrymen struggling without proper medical care. Taking pity on these warriors, they established a field hospital, using the sail of a ship as a makeshift tent. This humble beginning would eventually transform into one of the most powerful military orders in medieval history. Initially called the Order of Brothers of the German House of St. Mary in Jerusalem, the organization started purely as a charitable endeavor. Monks and lay brothers tended to sick and wounded German crusaders, following the example of the older Hospitallers. They wore simple white habits and devoted themselves to acts of mercy, never imagining the martial destiny that awaited them. In 1198, a pivotal transformation occurred. The order reorganized itself along the lines of the Knights Templar, adopting both military and religious functions. Brothers would now be both monks and warriors, sworn to poverty, chastity, and obedience, while also trained in the arts of combat. They adopted their iconic uniform, a white surcoat emblazoned with a stark black cross, a symbol that would become feared and respected across the medieval world. Pope Innocent III officially recognized the Teutonic Order in 1199, granting them the same privileges enjoyed by the Templars and Hospitallers. The order now had three classes of members: the Knight Brothers, who came from noble families and formed the military elite, the Priest Brothers, who attended to spiritual needs, and the Serving Brothers, who handled administrative and support duties. The early 13th century found the Teutonic Knights establishing themselves in the Crusader states of Outremer. They built fortresses, maintained garrisons, and participated in numerous campaigns against Muslim forces. Their Grand Master resided in Acre, the most important remaining Crusader stronghold after Jerusalem's fall. Hermann von Salza became Grand Master in 1210, and his leadership would prove transformational. A diplomat of exceptional skill, von Salza cultivated relationships with both Pope and Emperor, navigating the treacherous political waters of his age with remarkable dexterity. Under his guidance, the order accumulated lands and privileges throughout the Holy Roman Empire and beyond. The Teutonic Knights fought in the Fifth Crusade, participating in the ill-fated Egyptian campaign of 1218–1221. They witnessed the brief capture of Damietta and the subsequent disastrous advance into the Nile Delta, where the Crusader army found itself trapped by flooding and forced to surrender. These harsh lessons in warfare taught the knights the importance of logistics, planning, and understanding terrain. Emperor Frederick II's crusade of 1228–1229 saw the Teutonic Order playing a diplomatic role. Though excommunicated by the Pope, Frederick negotiated a treaty that temporarily returned Jerusalem to Christian control. Hermann von Salza served as mediator between the Emperor and Pope Gregory IX, demonstrating the order's growing political sophistication. The Knights established their first fortress in the Holy Land at Montfort, northeast of Acre, perched on a mountainous ridge. This castle served as the order's administrative headquarters and treasury. Its German name, Starkenburg, reflected the Knights' heritage. The fortress withstood several sieges before finally falling to Mamluk forces in 1271. As the 13th century progressed, the Crusader states steadily contracted under relentless Muslim pressure. The Teutonic Knights defended their territories valiantly, but the tide of history had turned. When Acre fell in 1291, the Order's presence in the Holy Land effectively ended. The Grand Master relocated to Venice, and the knights began seeking new purposes, new frontiers where their swords might serve Christendom. Even before the loss of the Holy Land, the Teutonic Knights had begun exploring opportunities elsewhere. In 1211, King Andrew II of Hungary invited them to Transylvania to defend his southeastern frontier against pagan Cuman raiders. This seemed an ideal mission, defending Christians against heathens in a wild borderland. The knights arrived with enthusiasm, establishing fortifications in the Burzenland region. They built 5 castles and several towns, bringing German settlers to cultivate the land. The Order's organizational efficiency transformed the frontier, creating a militarized zone that effectively repelled Cuman incursions. However, the Teutonic Knights' success bred conflict with their Hungarian hosts. The knights began acting increasingly independently, appealing directly to the Pope rather than acknowledging royal authority. They granted privileges to settlers without consulting the king, constructed unauthorized fortifications, and behaved more like sovereign rulers than vassals. When the knights requested that Pope Honorius III place their Transylvanian territories under direct papal protection, King Andrew II's patience expired. In 1225, he expelled the entire order from Hungary, confiscating their properties and fortifications. This harsh lesson taught the Teutonic Knights the importance of securing clear political authority before establishing themselves in new territories. The Hungarian episode, though ending in failure, provided valuable experience in frontier colonization and defense. The knights had demonstrated their ability to organize settlements, manage agricultural development, and create defensive systems in wild territories. These skills would prove invaluable in their next great endeavor. While the Teutonic Order regrouped after their Hungarian expulsion, another opportunity emerged far to the north. The Prussians, a pagan Baltic people, had been raiding Christian Poland for generations. Previous missionary efforts had largely failed, and the Polish Duke Conrad of Masovia faced an increasingly desperate situation as Prussian warriors burned settlements and enslaved Christian populations. In 1226, Duke Conrad offered the Teutonic Knights Chelmno land in exchange for defending Masovia against Prussian incursions. Having learned from their Hungarian experience, Grandmaster Hermann von Salza moved carefully. He secured the Golden Bull of Rimini from Emperor Frederick II, granting the Order sovereign rights over any territories they might conquer in Prussia. Pope Gregory IX issued similar guarantees, placing future conquests directly under papal protection. The knights arrived in Chelmno land in 1230, beginning what would become a brutal 50-year conquest. This was not the relatively organized warfare of the Crusader states, but savage frontier combat against skilled pagan warriors fighting for their homeland, freedom, and gods. The Prussians knew their forests, marshes, and rivers intimately, using guerrilla tactics that frustrated the heavily armored German knights. The Order's strategy combined military conquest with systematic colonization. After subduing a region, they immediately built a fortress, established a settlement, and imported German colonists. These civilians provided economic support, agricultural production, and population to hold conquered territories. Churches rose alongside castles, and missionary priests followed warriors into the wilderness. Fortresses like Thorn, Kulm, and Marienwerder became the foundations of Teutonic power. Built of wood initially, then stone, these strongholds controlled river crossings, trade routes, and strategic terrain. Each castle housed a garrison of knight brothers, serving brothers, and auxiliary troops, ready to respond to Prussian attacks or launch expeditions deeper into pagan territory. The Prussian tribes fought desperately. The Pomesanians, Pogesanians, Warmians, Natangians, Bartians, Nadruvians, Scolovians, Sudovians, and Sambians each resisted the invaders with determination.
They ambushed supply columns, besieged isolated fortresses,
and occasionally inflicted devastating defeats on overconfident German forces. In 1242, disaster struck when a major expedition ventured onto the frozen Lake Peipus to attack Russian territories. The battle on the ice saw Teutonic forces crushed by Prince Alexander Nevsky of Novgorod, teaching the knights the dangers of overextension. This defeat temporarily halted their eastward expansion, focusing attention back on the incomplete Prussian conquest. The Great Prussian Uprising of 1260–1274 nearly destroyed Teutonic power. Coordinated attacks overwhelmed isolated fortresses, wiping out garrisons and destroying years of colonization. The Prussians, fighting for their very existence, displayed remarkable courage and tactical skill. Only the Order's major castles survived, and reinforcements from Germany barely prevented complete disaster. The knights responded with merciless determination. They adopted scorched earth tactics, destroying crops and villages to starve the Prussians into submission. Winter campaigns, traditionally avoided, became common as the knights exploited their superior logistics and equipment. Captured rebels faced execution, and entire communities were forcibly relocated to break tribal connections. By 1280, Prussian resistance had finally been broken, though at tremendous cost to both sides. The native population had been decimated by war, famine, and disease. Survivors faced assimilation or servitude in the new German-dominated society. The land itself bore scars, abandoned villages, burned forests, and fields returned to wilderness. With Prussia conquered, the Teutonic Knights faced the challenge of transforming a war-ravaged frontier into a functioning state. The Ordensstaat, or Orders State, emerged as one of medieval Europe's most unusual political entities, a theocratic military republic governed by warrior monks, owing nominal allegiance to Pope and Emperor but functionally independent. The Grand Master ruled from Marienburg, an enormous fortress monastery constructed on the Nogat River. This architectural marvel combined defensive strength with administrative functionality and monastic austerity. Its brick walls, soaring towers, and vast halls proclaimed Teutonic power, while its chapels and dormitories reminded knight brothers of their religious vows. The Order's government was surprisingly sophisticated. A Grand Chapter of high officials advised the Grand Master. The Grand Commander handled daily administration. The Marshal commanded military forces. The Treasurer managed finances. The Hospitaller oversaw medical care, and the Quartermaster controlled supply logistics. Regional commanders governed territorial districts, reporting regularly to Marienburg. The Ordensstaat's economy rested on agriculture, trade, and resource exploitation. German settlers cleared forests, drained marshlands, and established villages following systematic plans. The Order introduced advanced farming techniques, crop rotation, and livestock breeding. Vast estates produced grain, timber, amber, and other commodities for export to Western Europe. Trade became particularly important. The Knights established ports along the Baltic coast, participating in the Hanseatic League's commercial network. Ships carried Prussian amber, furs, timber, and grain to Lübeck, Bruges, and London, returning with textiles, metalwork, and luxury goods. Customs duties enriched the Order's treasury, funding military campaigns and architectural projects. The Knights also developed a sophisticated administrative system. Written records documented everything: tax assessments, land grants, legal proceedings, military rosters, and financial accounts. This bureaucratic efficiency allowed the Order to govern effectively despite its relatively small number of knight brothers, never exceeding about 1,000 at peak strength. Justice was administered through territorial courts overseen by Order officials. German law largely replaced Prussian customs, though some indigenous practices survived in modified form. The Order emphasized predictability and fairness in legal matters, understanding that stable governance required civilian populations to accept their rule as legitimate. Towns received charters granting self-government privileges, though ultimate authority remained with the order. Danzig, Königsberg, Elbing, and other cities flourished as commercial centers, attracting German merchants, craftsmen, and artisans. Gothic churches and guild halls rose in market squares, while city walls protected prosperous burghers from external threats. The conversion of Prussia to Christianity proceeded alongside political consolidation. Bishops administered dioceses under nominal supervision of the Archbishop of Riga, but the order maintained effective control over ecclesiastical affairs in their territories. Churches and monasteries proliferated, serving both spiritual and cultural functions, as German Christianity supplanted pagan Baltic traditions. Even as Prussia was being organized, the Teutonic Knights faced continuing conflict with Lithuania, the last major pagan power in Europe. The Lithuanians proved far more formidable opponents than the fragmented Prussian tribes. United under capable leaders, possessing sophisticated military organization, and controlling vast forested territories, they resisted Christianization and German expansion for over a century. The Lithuanian Grand Duke Mindaugas briefly converted to Christianity in 1251, receiving a royal crown from Pope Innocent IV. However, after his assassination in 1263, Lithuania reverted to paganism and intensified resistance against the Teutonic Order. Subsequent rulers like Traidenis and Vitenis organized powerful defensive systems and launched devastating raids into Prussian territories. The wars developed into a savage annual cycle. Each summer, the Teutonic Knights launched Risen, or military expeditions, into Lithuanian territory. These weren't traditional campaigns aiming at permanent conquest, but rather massive raids designed to devastate the countryside, capture slaves, and demonstrate Christian martial prowess. Knights from across Europe joined these expeditions, viewing them as crusades granting spiritual merit. Winter campaigns were particularly harsh. The Knights exploited frozen rivers and marshes to penetrate deep into Lithuanian forests, attacking settlements when defenders were least prepared. Lithuanian villages burned, crops were destroyed, and populations were killed or enslaved. The brutality on both sides was extreme, with neither showing mercy to defeated enemies. Lithuania responded with equal ferocity. Lithuanian raiders struck into Prussia, Livonia, and even distant Poland, burning German settlements and carrying off captives. They developed sophisticated intelligence networks, learning when the order's forces were dispersed or engaged elsewhere. Lithuanian tactical innovations, particularly their use of light cavalry and ambush tactics, inflicted numerous defeats on overconfident Crusader armies. Duke Gediminas, ruling from 1316 to 1341, transformed Lithuania into a regional power. He expanded territories eastward into Rus's principalities weakened by Mongol invasions, creating a vast state stretching from the Baltic to the Black Sea approaches. Though pagan himself, Gediminas pragmatically tolerated Christianity in conquered territories and maintained diplomatic contacts with Western Europe. The arrival of foreign knights for summer campaigns gave the Lithuanian wars an international character. English, French, Burgundian, and even Spanish nobles traveled to Prussia seeking martial glory and crusading credentials. The order hosted these guests lavishly at Marienburg, organizing elaborate tournaments and feasts before leading them into Lithuanian forests for brutal combat. These crusading expeditions became fashionable among European nobility. A young knight could gain reputation, demonstrate martial prowess, and earn spiritual merit by participating in a Risen. Chronicles record famous participants. Henry Bolingbroke, future King Henry IV of England, campaigned with the Teutonic Knights multiple times in the 1390s. However, the strategic situation was shifting. Under Algirdas and Kęstutis in the mid-14th century, Lithuania reached its greatest territorial extent, controlling much of modern Belarus and Ukraine. The order found itself confronting not a pagan frontier society, but a sophisticated state with professional armies, fortified positions, and diplomatic connections throughout Eastern Europe. The mid to late 14th century represented the Teutonic Order's zenith. The Ordensstaat had become one of Europe's most powerful political entities, controlling Prussia, extensive Baltic territories, and exercising dominant influence over the region's trade. The Order's military reputation stood unmatched, and Marienburg served as a center of Gothic art, architecture, and culture. Grandmaster Winrich von Kniprode, ruling from 1351 to 1382, exemplified this golden age. His long tenure brought stability, prosperity, and international prestige. Under his leadership, the Order completed its conquest of heathen territories while developing Prussia's infrastructure and economy. Castles, churches, and commercial facilities proliferated throughout the Ordensstaat. The Order's military effectiveness reached legendary status. Heavily armored knight brothers, supported by professional sergeants and auxiliary troops, formed one of medieval Europe's most formidable fighting forces. Their discipline, training, and equipment surpassed most contemporary armies. Castles throughout Prussia and Livonia provided strategic depth, allowing rapid response to threats from any direction. Trade brought enormous wealth. The Ordensstaat controlled the lucrative amber trade, with Baltic amber prized throughout Europe for jewelry and religious objects. Timber from Prussian forests supplied shipbuilders across the continent. Grain exports fed growing urban populations in Flanders and England. The Order's merchants competed successfully with the Hanseatic League, sometimes cooperating, sometimes conflicting. Marienburg itself became a wonder of medieval architecture. Continual construction expanded the fortress into a vast complex housing hundreds of knight brothers, administrators, servants, and visitors. The Grand Master's palace featured elaborate vaulted halls decorated with sculptures and frescoes. The castle church contained magnificent altars and religious artwork. Storage facilities could stockpile supplies for years-long campaigns. The Order maintained diplomatic relations with courts throughout Europe. Grand Masters corresponded with popes, emperors, kings, and princes, positioning themselves as defenders of Christendom against pagan threats. The Order's ambassadors attended councils, negotiated treaties, and represented Teutonic interests at various European courts. Cultural patronage flourished. The knights commissioned religious manuscripts illuminated by skilled artists. Poets and chroniclers recorded the Order's deeds in Latin and German verse. Musicians performed in castle chapels and feast halls. The Order's libraries preserved texts covering theology, law, history, and practical knowledge, making Marienburg a center of learning. Yet seeds of future problems were already germinating. The Order's rigid hierarchy left little room for adaptation to changing circumstances. As Prussia became increasingly German and Christian, the original crusading mission lost relevance. The Knight Brothers, sworn to celibacy and poverty, couldn't establish dynastic continuity or personal stake in territories they governed. Relations with neighboring powers grew complicated. Poland, though Christian, increasingly viewed the Ordensstaat as a threat rather than ally. The Polish crown claimed overlordship over Chelmno land and Pomerania, territories the Order considered rightfully theirs through conquest and papal grant. Lithuanian conversion to Christianity would eliminate the crusading justification for continued warfare. The Order's social structure created tensions. German knights ruled over populations including indigenous Prussians, Polish settlers, and other ethnic groups. Cities desired greater autonomy. The nobility in territories like Chelmland sought privileges the Order restricted. These internal pressures would eventually challenge Teutonic authority. In 1385, a diplomatic revolution transformed Eastern European politics. Grand Duke Jogaila of Lithuania agreed to marry Queen Jadwiga of Poland, converting to Christianity and bringing his entire realm into the Catholic faith. This union of Kruo united Europe's largest state, Lithuania, with one of its most populous kingdoms, Poland, creating a superpower that would dominate the region for centuries. For the Teutonic Order, Lithuanian conversion represented catastrophe. Their entire raison d'etre had been crusading against pagans. Now their primary enemy had become Christian, eliminating the ideological foundation for their military campaigns and territorial expansion. The Order's propaganda portraying themselves as defenders of Christendom rang hollow when they fought fellow Catholics. Grand Master Konrad von Jungingen initially hoped diplomatic maneuvering might preserve the Order's position. He questioned the sincerity of Lithuanian conversion, suggesting many Lithuanians remained secretly pagan. He negotiated with Hungarian interests, opposed to Polish expansion. He cultivated relationships with the Pope and Emperor, seeking support against the growing Polish-Lithuanian alliance. However, political reality was shifting beneath the Order's feet. Without a crusading mission, territorial disputes became purely secular conflicts. The Polish crown pressed claims to Pomerelia and Chelmno land, arguing the Order illegally occupied Polish territories. Lithuanian nobles sought revenge for decades of devastating raids. Cities and nobles within the Ordensstaat began questioning whether they benefited from continued Teutonic governance. Small-scale border conflicts escalated through the 1390s. The Order supported Lithuanian pretenders against Jogaila, now baptized as Władysław Jagiełło. Polish forces raided Teutonic territories. Diplomatic accusations flew between Marienburg and Krakow. Both sides prepared for the inevitable major confrontation. The Order's military situation was actually quite strong. Their treasuries overflowed with accumulated wealth. Fortifications throughout Prussia could withstand lengthy sieges. The Knight brothers remained disciplined, well-equipped professional warriors. Thousands of auxiliary troops supplemented the Order's military strength. Many believed the Ordensstaat invincible. Grand Master Ulrich von Jungingen, elected in 1407, pursued an aggressive policy toward Poland-Lithuania. A proud, confident warrior, he believed Teutonic military superiority would prevail in any conflict. He rejected diplomatic compromises, insisting on the Order's sovereign rights to all territories they controlled. When war finally erupted in 1409, he welcomed the opportunity to crush the Order's enemies decisively. The Great War began with territorial disputes over Samogitia, a Lithuanian region the Order claimed. Both sides mobilized their full military capabilities for what would be the decisive campaign. The Order called upon allies and crusading volunteers. Poland-Lithuania assembled the largest army Eastern Europe had yet seen, drawing upon Polish, Lithuanian, Ruses, and Tatar contingents. July 15, 1410. The fields near the villages of Grunwald, Tannenberg, and Ludwigsdorf. This date and location would become seared into historical memory, marking one of medieval Europe's largest and bloodiest battles. The Teutonic Order's army, approximately 27,000 strong, confronted a Polish-Lithuanian force of perhaps 39,000. Grand Master Ulrich von Jungingen commanded personally, confident in his knight's superior training, equipment, and discipline. His battle plan was straightforward. Use heavily armored cavalry to smash through enemy formations, then exploit the breakthrough for complete victory. The Polish-Lithuanian army, commanded by King Władysław Jagiełło and Grand Duke Vytautas of Lithuania, adopted defensive positions on favorable terrain. Their strategy accepted the Order's reputation for frontal assault power while preparing responses to neutralize it. Light Lithuanian cavalry would harass and tire the German knights, while Polish heavy cavalry waited for the decisive moment. Battle commenced in the morning. The Teutonic forces advanced in disciplined formations, banners displaying the black cross on white backgrounds. Initial clashes favored the order, as their heavily armored knights drove into enemy positions. The Lithuanian forces gave ground, apparently breaking under pressure from German cavalry charges. However, this was tactical withdrawal rather than genuine rout. The Lithuanians drew Teutonic forces forward, stretching their formations and tiring their horses. Meanwhile, Polish heavy cavalry had been held in reserve, awaiting the critical moment. When the German advance lost cohesion, Jagiełło committed his fresh forces against the overextended Teutonic lines. The battle's character transformed. What had seemed like inevitable Teutonic victory became desperate struggle. Polish knights, equally well-equipped and more numerous, crashed into German formations. The weight of numbers began telling as Teutonic reserves committed piecemeal, unable to restore the situation. Grandmaster Ulrich von Jungingen, seeing his carefully planned offensive collapsing, led his household knights in a desperate charge attempting to reach the Polish king's position. If they could kill Jagiełło, the enemy army might dissolve. The attack penetrated deep into Polish lines but ultimately failed. The Grandmaster fell in the fighting, killed along with most of the order's senior commanders. The Teutonic army disintegrated. Surrounded forces fought desperately, but were systematically destroyed. Knight brothers, trained to never surrender, died where they stood. Auxiliary troops, less ideologically committed, fled when possible. By evening, the battlefield was carpeted with thousands of dead, and the Teutonic Order's military power lay shattered. The casualties were catastrophic. Approximately 8,000 Teutonic soldiers died, including the Grand Master, most high officials, and hundreds of knight brothers. Polish-Lithuanian losses were significant but sustainable. More devastating than the immediate casualties was the psychological impact. The legendary Teutonic Order had been decisively defeated by enemies they had long dominated. News of the disaster stunned Europe. The supposedly invincible order had been crushed in a single afternoon. German princes, who had viewed the Ordensstaat as representing German power in Eastern Europe, faced the reality that this bastion might fall. The Pope and Emperor, traditional supporters of the order, now had to reconsider their Eastern European policies. Heinrich von Plauen, commander of Schwedt Castle, gathered survivors and organized desperate resistance. As acting Grand Master, he understood the order's survival depended on preserving their fortresses until political circumstances changed. Marienburg, the order's capital, withstood siege through the following months as von Plauen rallied remaining forces. The First Peace of Thorn in 1411 ended immediate hostilities on surprisingly moderate terms. Poland-Lithuania, despite total military victory, accepted limited territorial gains. The order ceded Samogitia to Lithuania and paid enormous indemnities, but retained most Prussian territories. This restraint reflected various factors: concern about imperial intervention, internal Polish-Lithuanian political dynamics, and genuine uncertainty about whether completely destroying the order served regional stability. Grunwald marked a watershed, beginning the order's long decline from European great power to increasingly irrelevant anachronism. The defeat shattered the aura of invincibility that had protected Teutonic interests for generations. Enemies sensed weakness, while subjects questioned whether continued obedience served their interests. Financial crisis followed military disaster. The enormous indemnities imposed after Grunwald drained the order's treasury. Mercenary armies required for defense cost vast sums, forcing borrowing at usurious rates. The Grand Masters implemented desperate taxation measures, alienating cities and nobles who had previously accepted Teutonic governance. Economic prosperity that had characterized the Golden Age evaporated in fiscal crisis. Internal political strife plagued the Ordensstaat. Heinrich von Plauen, who had saved the order immediately after Grunwald, was deposed by rivals in 1413. Subsequent Grand Masters faced constant intrigue, factionalism, and challenges to their authority. The Knight brothers, traumatized by defeat and uncertain about the order's future, lost the unity and discipline that had once been their greatest strength. Cities and nobles began asserting independence. Danzig, Königsberg, Elbing, and other urban centers insisted on greater autonomy in exchange for continued financial support. The Prussian nobility, having accumulated grievances against the order's restrictive policies, formed the Prussian Confederation in 1440, explicitly opposing Teutonic governance. The Ordensstaat was fracturing from within. Periodic wars with Poland-Lithuania continued, each further weakening the order. The Hunger War of 1414 saw more territorial losses. Conflicts over Samogitia dragged on until 1422, when the order finally surrendered the region permanently. Each defeat cost territory, money, and prestige, creating a downward spiral of military inadequacy and political weakness. The Council of Constance, 1414 to 1418, witnessed a propaganda battle between the order and Poland. Polish representatives, including the rector of Krakow University, Paweł Wojtkowicz, challenged the entire crusading ideology, arguing that forced conversion contradicted Christian principles and that pagan peoples possessed natural rights to their territories. Though the council didn't rule definitively against the order, these arguments undermined their ideological foundations. Grand Master Paul von Rustdorf, 1422-1441, attempted reforms addressing the order's structural problems. He sought reconciliation with discontented cities and nobles, offering concessions to restore internal peace. He negotiated with Poland-Lithuania, seeking stable boundaries and reduced tensions. He tried modernizing the order's military, recognizing that traditional heavily armored cavalry had been superseded by newer tactical developments. However, reform came too late and accomplished too little. The fundamental problem was irreparable. A military-religious order without a credible crusading mission lacked legitimacy in governing secular territories. The Knight brothers, bound by monastic vows, couldn't establish dynastic legitimacy. The order's theocratic governance structure was fundamentally unsuited to administering an increasingly German, Christian, economically sophisticated state. The 13 Years' War, 1454-1466, brought catastrophe. The Prussian Confederation, including major cities and most nobility, rebelled against the order, requesting incorporation into Poland. King Casimir IV Jagiellon accepted, beginning a lengthy, devastating conflict. The order fought desperately, but faced enemies both external, Polish armies, and internal, rebellious subjects. The war revealed how completely circumstances had changed. The order could barely afford mercenary armies, while revenues from their territories flowed to enemies. Fortresses surrendered to rebels or fell to Polish siege. The Knight brothers, never numerous, couldn't garrison all threatened positions. Cities opening their gates to Polish forces determined the conflict's outcome more than battlefield victories. The Second Peace of Thorn, 1466, formalized disaster. The order ceded Pomerelia, Chelmno land, and Marienburg to Poland, losing their richest territories and symbolic capital. Remaining Prussian lands became a Polish fief, with Grand Masters required to swear homage to Polish kings. The proud Ordensstaat had been reduced to a vassal state, dependent on Polish tolerance for continued existence. The last decades of the Teutonic Order's existence as a territorial power witnessed desperate attempts to escape Polish domination while managing internal decay. Grand Masters sought alliances with anyone opposing Poland, the Holy Roman Emperor, various German princes, even occasionally Russia. None proved willing to seriously challenge Polish supremacy in Prussia. The order's composition was changing. Fewer Germans were joining as Knight brothers, as careers in the increasingly powerless organization offered limited prospects. The Grand Masters increasingly came from German noble families, using the position for dynastic ambitions rather than crusading ideals. The religious character that had once defined the order faded as political considerations dominated. Grand Master Albrecht von Brandenburg-Ansbach, elected in 1511, represented these new realities. A member of the Hohenzollern dynasty, he viewed the Grand Mastership primarily as a political position. Initially, he pursued traditional policies, seeking imperial support against Poland, attempting to strengthen the order's military capacity, hoping to overturn the humiliating Treaty of Thorn. The Protestant Reformation transformed everything. Martin Luther's theological revolution spread rapidly through German-speaking territories, including Prussia. Many questioned whether Catholic monastic orders still served valid religious purposes. The concept of military religious orders seemed increasingly medieval and outdated in the 16th century's changing religious landscape. Albrecht von Brandenburg-Ansbach encountered Lutheran ideas through contacts with Reformation theologians. These conversations raised profound questions. Why should Knight brothers remain celibate? Why should a secular territory be governed by monastic vows? What crusading mission justified the order's continued existence? The answers increasingly suggested that the traditional form was obsolete. In 1525, Albrecht made the momentous decision to secularize. He converted to Lutheranism, dissolved the Teutonic Order's Prussian branch, and transformed the territory into a hereditary duchy under his personal rule. The Polish king, surprisingly, accepted this arrangement, granting Albrecht the title Duke of Prussia in exchange for feudal homage. The Ordensstaat had ended, replaced by a conventional secular principality. This transformation proved momentous for European history. The Duchy of Prussia remained connected to the Hohenzollern dynasty, eventually merging with Brandenburg to form Brandenburg-Prussia, then the Kingdom of Prussia, ultimately becoming the core of modern Germany. The Teutonic Order's territorial legacy thus indirectly shaped modern European political geography. The order itself continued existing in a reduced form. Branches in Germany proper, never fully controlled from Prussia, remained under Catholic Grand Masters. The order retained territories in southern Germany and maintained a presence in Vienna. However, these remnants bore little resemblance to the powerful crusading order that had conquered Prussia. Napoleon Bonaparte effectively ended the order's remaining territorial power in the early 19th century. During his reorganization of Germany, he secularized church properties, including Teutonic holdings. The order was formally suppressed in 1809, though not completely dissolved. A revived form continued in Austria, but purely as a ceremonial and charitable organization. Today, the Teutonic Order still exists as the Brothers of the German House of St. Mary in Jerusalem, an ecclesiastical corporation headquartered in Vienna. Its members, now including women, engage in charitable and medical work, returning to the original hospitaller mission begun in Acre over 8 centuries ago. The military and political dimensions have completely vanished, leaving only the religious and charitable foundations. As we near the end of our journey through Teutonic history, it's worth reflecting on the order's complex legacy. Few medieval institutions have provoked such varied interpretations. Heroic Christian warriors defending Europe against paganism, brutal colonizers destroying indigenous cultures, skilled administrators building prosperous territories, or anachronistic theocrats unable to adapt to changing circumstances. The Teutonic Knights undeniably shaped Baltic history profoundly. They brought Christianity, German culture, and Western European political and economic systems to regions previously outside mainstream European civilization. Cities they founded became important commercial and cultural centers. Administrative structures they established influenced regional governance for centuries. The cultural landscape of Prussia bore their imprint until the 20th century. However, this development came at tremendous cost to indigenous populations. The Prussian tribes were effectively destroyed, killed in warfare, enslaved, forcibly assimilated, or driven from ancestral lands. Their languages vanished, their pagan religion was suppressed, and their cultural traditions were largely obliterated. The Teutonic conquest represented cultural genocide by any modern standard, even if typical for medieval colonialism. The Order's military legacy proved significant. They pioneered castle-building techniques adapted to Baltic conditions, creating fortress networks that controlled vast territories with relatively small garrisons. Their tactical innovations influenced military thinking across Europe. The concept of a professional military force bound by religious discipline provided a model emulated elsewhere. Politically, the Ordensstaat represented a unique experiment in theocratic governance. A religious order administering secular territories created tensions between spiritual ideals and practical governance requirements. The experiment ultimately failed, but provided historical insight into the challenges of combining religious and political authority. The Teutonic Order's cultural patronage deserves recognition. Marienburg stands as a Gothic architectural masterpiece. The chronicles, documents, and administrative records they produced provide invaluable historical sources. Their promotion of German language and culture in Eastern Europe had long-lasting linguistic and cultural implications. The Order's eventual defeat and dissolution demonstrated the dangers of institutional inflexibility. Their inability to adapt when the original crusading mission became obsolete doomed them to irrelevance. Organizations that cannot evolve with changing circumstances ultimately face extinction, regardless of past glories. Modern perspectives on the Teutonic Knights vary significantly by nationality and ideology. German historians traditionally emphasize the civilizing mission and cultural achievements. Polish historiography highlighted the Order's aggression and eventual defeat. Lithuanian scholars focus on resistance to conquest and cultural survival. Romantic nationalism in the 19th century appropriated Teutonic imagery for various ideological purposes. The Nazis particularly perverted Teutonic symbolism, claiming the Knights as predecessors for their Eastern expansion and racial ideology. This association poisoned the Order's historical reputation, though scholars recognize the fundamental differences between medieval crusading orders and 20th century totalitarianism. Disentangling historical reality from nationalist mythology remains an ongoing challenge. While we have focused primarily on Prussia, the Teutonic Order's Livonian branch deserves attention as a parallel story with distinct characteristics. The Livonian Brothers of the Sword, a separate military order, had conquered parts of modern Latvia and Estonia in the early 13th century. After suffering a devastating defeat to pagan Lithuanians and Samogitians at the Battle of Saul in 1236, the survivors merged with the Teutonic Order. The Livonian Landmeister governed semi-autonomously from the Prussian Grand Master, though theoretically subordinate. This arrangement created occasional tensions, as Livonian and Prussian interests didn't always align. The Livonian territories included different ethnic populations, faced different enemies, and developed somewhat distinct political cultures. Riga, the major city in Livonia, maintained complex relationships with the Order. The Archbishop of Riga claimed authority over the region, competing with the Landmeister for political dominance. Conflicts between ecclesiastical and military authorities periodically erupted into armed confrontations, weakening Christian control over territories surrounded by powerful enemies. The Livonian Order faced threats from multiple directions. Lithuanian raiders struck from the south. Russian principalities, particularly Novgorod and Pskov, contested control of borderlands and Orthodox populations. Denmark claimed northern Estonia through historical conquest. Sweden eventually entered regional politics, complicating the strategic situation further. Baltic trade enriched Livonia, as it did Prussia. The cities of Riga, Reval, and Dorpat participated in Hanseatic commercial networks, exporting timber, furs, grain, and other commodities. The Order taxed this commerce, funding their military establishments and administrative apparatus. Control over trade routes and port facilities provided both wealth and strategic leverage. The Livonian Order developed its own distinct identity over generations. Livonian Knight brothers often came from local German families that had settled in the Baltic territories, creating a more indigenous character than Prussia's order. They identified with their specific region, sometimes prioritizing Livonian interests over broader Teutonic concerns when the two conflicted. After Prussia's secularization in 1525, the Livonian order initially continued independently. However, they faced growing pressure from expanding powers, particularly Muscovite Russia under Ivan IV. The Livonian War, beginning in 1558, brought invasion and devastation. The order proved incapable of defending against modern armies, and by 1561, the Livonian territories had been partitioned among Poland, Lithuania, Sweden, and Denmark. The last Landmeister, Gotthard Kettler, followed Albrecht's example, secularizing the southern Livonian territories into the Duchy of Courland and Semigalia, becoming its duke under Polish suzerainty. This duchy survived until the 18th century, eventually absorbed into the Russian Empire. Like Prussia, the order's Livonian legacy transformed into secular political structures. To truly understand the Teutonic Order, we should glimpse daily life within their state during the 14th century Golden Age. This helps us see beyond battles and politics to the lived reality of people within this unique society. A Knight Brothers' Day began before dawn with prayers in the castle chapel. The rule required regular religious observances. Matins, lauds, prime, terce, sext, none, vespers, and compline marked the canonical hours. Between prayers, brothers attended to military training, administrative duties, or overseeing agricultural operations on the order's estates. The Knight brothers lived under strict discipline. They slept in dormitories, ate communal meals in refectories, and owned no personal property beyond basic necessities. Their white mantles with black crosses were uniforms, not personal garments. They could not marry, leave the order without permission, or engage in frivolous activities. This monastic discipline maintained cohesion and prevented the dynastic divisions that plagued secular rulers. Combat training occupied significant time. Knights practiced with sword, lance, and mace. They maintained riding skills, essential for cavalry warfare. They learned siege techniques, both attacking and defending fortifications. Physical fitness was emphasized, as wearing heavy armor while fighting required tremendous strength and endurance. Administrative duties filled much of peacetime. Knight brothers served as castle commanders, estate managers, customs officials, and judges. They supervised construction projects, managed agricultural operations, and negotiated with merchants. The order's effectiveness rested partly on combining military and administrative capabilities in the same individuals. For common people in the Ordensstaat, life centered around agriculture and craft production. German colonists cleared forests, established villages, and cultivated fields according to planned layouts. The three-field crop rotation system maximized productivity. Peasants owed various obligations to the order or local landlords: labor service, crop shares, and monetary payments. Towns offered different opportunities. Merchants engaged in Baltic trade, shipping commodities throughout the Hanseatic commercial network. Craftsmen produced goods for local consumption and export. Leather workers, blacksmiths, weavers, brewers, and countless other specialists. Guild systems regulated production quality, training standards, and commercial practices. Market days brought countryside and town together. Peasants sold agricultural products, purchased manufactured goods, and heard news from beyond their villages. Merchants displayed wares from distant lands: Flemish textiles, English wool, French wines, and exotic spices from Orient trade routes. Entertainers performed in market squares, and religious festivals provided community celebrations. The indigenous Prussian population, those who survived the conquest, occupied the lowest social tier. Many had been enslaved during the wars, though some gained freedom over time. Prussians faced discrimination, restricted opportunities, and cultural suppression. Over generations, many assimilated into German-dominated society, though cultural memory preserved some traditions. Justice was administered through territorial courts. The order emphasized written law, record-keeping, and procedural regularity. Serious crimes like murder, theft, and heresy faced severe punishments, including execution. Minor offenses might result in fines, corporal punishment, or public humiliation. The legal system, while harsh by modern standards, was relatively predictable and less arbitrary than some contemporary alternatives. Religious life permeated society. Parish churches served spiritual needs, marked time through the liturgical calendar, and provided social centers. Priests conducted masses, administered sacraments, and instructed laypeople in Catholic doctrine. Monasteries and convents housed contemplative communities and provided education, medical care, and hospitality. Architectural projects demonstrated the order's wealth and ambition. Master builders supervised construction of churches, castles, and civic buildings in the Gothic style. Skilled craftsmen created sculptures, stained glass, and decorative elements. These projects employed hundreds of workers, from quarrymen extracting stone to artists painting frescoes. Understanding Teutonic military capabilities requires examining their organizational structure and tactical doctrines. The Order developed sophisticated military systems that made them formidable opponents for over a century. The Knight brothers formed the military elite. Drawn from German noble families, they received extensive martial training from youth. Each brother maintained expensive equipment, armor, weapons, multiple horses, and various accessories. The investment in individual knights created highly effective but expensive military forces. Heavy cavalry formed the tactical core. Knight brothers, mounted on powerful war horses and wearing complete armor, could deliver devastating charges against enemy formations. The shock impact of armored cavalry hitting infantry lines often decided medieval battles. The knights trained extensively in coordinated charges, maintaining formation cohesion that multiplied their effectiveness. The Order also maintained significant infantry forces. Serving brothers, drawn from non-noble families, provided professional foot soldiers. Crossbowmen delivered powerful ranged fire, capable of penetrating armor at close ranges. Pikemen and halberdiers defended against cavalry charges or attacked enemy infantry. These troops, though less prestigious than Knight brothers, were essential for sieges and defensive operations. Auxiliary forces supplemented the Order's professional troops. Prussian and Livonian levies provided light infantry and cavalry. When major campaigns were planned, the Order summoned contingents from cities and landed estates. During crusading expeditions against Lithuania, foreign volunteers added international components to Teutonic armies. Logistics were sophisticated. The Order maintained extensive supply systems, capable of supporting armies during lengthy campaigns. Castles served as supply depots, storing grain, salted meat, weapons, and other necessities. River transport moved supplies efficiently throughout the relatively flat Prussian terrain. This logistical capability allowed the Order to campaign when enemies expected winter to prevent military operations. Castle networks provided strategic depth. Fortresses positioned throughout the Ordensstadt could shelter defeated armies, serve as bases for counterattacks, and control territories even when field forces were defeated. The Order's engineering expertise made their castles extremely difficult to capture, without lengthy sieges requiring substantial resources. Tactical flexibility developed through hard experience. Early Teutonic commanders relied heavily on cavalry charges, sometimes with disastrous results when facing terrain or enemies unsuited to this approach. Over time, the Order learned combined arms tactics, coordinating cavalry, infantry, and missile troops for mutual support. Intelligence gathering was taken seriously. The Order maintained networks of informants in enemy territories, providing warning of attacks and information about opponent capabilities. Reconnaissance expeditions probed enemy territories, gathering intelligence while inflicting damage. This information advantage often allowed the Order to concentrate forces against threats while leaving other areas lightly defended. Naval forces complemented land armies. The Order built galleys and other vessels for Baltic operations, transporting troops, protecting merchant shipping, and projecting power along the coast. Naval battles occasionally decided control over strategic regions, particularly in conflicts with Denmark and Sweden over Baltic territories. Training never ceased. Even in peacetime, Knight brothers maintained combat readiness through constant practice. Mock combats, tournaments, and hunting expeditions kept skills sharp. This professional approach contrasted with feudal levies that might only train occasionally, giving the Order qualitative advantages over numerically superior but less prepared opponents. However, military effectiveness depended on resources. The Order's relatively small number of Knight brothers, never exceeding about 1,000, limited their capacity to sustain simultaneous campaigns on multiple fronts. Heavy casualties in major battles like Grunwald could cripple the Order's military power for years, as replacing trained knight brothers required time. The Ordnungsstaat's power ultimately rested on economic foundations that generated resources for military campaigns, administrative operations, and architectural projects. Understanding these economic systems illuminates how the Order maintained their state for 2 centuries. Agriculture provided the fundamental economic base. The Order directly controlled vast estates cultivated by peasant labor. Grain production, particularly rye and wheat, supplied both domestic consumption and export markets. The relatively fertile Prussian plains, when properly cultivated using German agricultural techniques, yielded substantial harvests in favorable years. The 3-field crop rotation system maximized productivity. Fields alternated between winter grains, spring grains, and fallow periods, maintaining soil fertility while producing annual harvests. Peasants also maintained vegetable gardens, raised livestock, and engaged in small-scale craft production, creating diverse rural economies. Forests represented valuable resources. Timber for construction and shipbuilding was harvested systematically, with the Order regulating logging to prevent depletion. Hunting provided meat, furs, and sport for knight brothers. Forest resources like honey, wax, mushrooms, and medicinal herbs supplemented agricultural production. Amber mining brought extraordinary profits. Baltic amber, prized throughout medieval Europe for jewelry and religious objects, washed onto beaches or was extracted from shallow coastal waters. The Order monopolized amber trade, severely punishing unauthorized collection or sale. This monopoly generated enormous revenues from relatively small material inputs. Commerce and trade taxation enriched the treasury. Cities like Danzig handled huge volumes of trade, shipping Prussian products throughout the Hanseatic network. The Order levied customs duties on imports and exports, tolls on river and road transport, and various commercial taxes. As Baltic trade expanded through the medieval commercial revolution, these revenues grew substantially. The Order operated their own commercial enterprises. They owned merchant ships, trading directly rather than only taxing others' commerce. They maintained warehouses in major trading cities throughout Northern Europe. They participated in banking and credit operations, lending money to merchants and princes at interest. Manufacturing developed in Ordnungsstaat cities. Craftsmen produced textiles, leather goods, metalwork, pottery, and countless other products. Guild regulations maintained quality standards and controlled competition. The Order both taxed this production and directly operated some manufacturing facilities, particularly those related to military supplies. Fishing provided significant food supplies and trade goods. Baltic herring, salted and packed in barrels, fed populations throughout Northern Europe during Lent and other fasting periods when meat consumption was prohibited. The Order taxed fishing operations while also directly engaging in commercial fishing enterprises. Mining operations extracted various minerals. Iron ore deposits supplied metalworking industries producing tools, weapons, and other iron products. Salt production from coastal operations provided essential preservatives for food storage. Other minerals contributed to the diverse economic base. The Order's financial management was sophisticated. Written accounting records tracked revenues and expenditures. The treasury at Marienburg centralized financial administration, though regional commanders handled local finances. The Order could mobilize substantial resources quickly when military necessity demanded, borrowing against future revenues when immediate funds proved insufficient. Taxation systems extracted resources from subject populations. Peasants paid various dues in crops, labor, and money. Towns remitted negotiated annual payments. Merchants paid customs duties. The clergy contributed to special levies. While taxation levels were not necessarily higher than elsewhere in medieval Europe, the Order's efficient collection systems ensured revenues actually reached the treasury. Economic crises eventually undermined the Order's power. The wars with Poland-Lithuania disrupted trade, destroyed agricultural production, and consumed accumulated wealth. Indemnity payments drained resources for decades. Borrowing at usurious rates to fund mercenary armies created unsustainable debt. When revenues declined while expenses increased, fiscal collapse became inevitable. Despite the Teutonic Order's military character, religious devotion remained central to their identity and daily practice. Understanding their spirituality reveals the medieval worldview that justified and sustained their enterprise. The rule of the Teutonic Order, based on the Templar rule but adapted for German circumstances, structured religious life. Knight brothers took vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, binding themselves permanently to the order. These vows weren't mere formalities but serious spiritual commitments enforced through rigorous discipline. Poverty meant renouncing personal property. Knight brothers owned nothing individually, with all possessions belonging to the order collectively. They couldn't accept gifts, inherit family property, or accumulate wealth. This prevented the dynastic concerns and personal ambitions that fragmented secular authorities. Chastity prohibited sexual relations and marriage. Knight brothers lived as celibate monks, channeling energies toward military and administrative service rather than family concerns. This celibacy distinguished them from secular knights, who established dynasties and divided inheritances among heirs. Obedience required submission to superiors' commands. Knight brothers obeyed the Grand Master, regional commanders, and other officials in the hierarchy. This military-style discipline maintained organizational cohesion and enabled coordinated action across vast territories. Daily prayers structured time. The canonical hours, observed in castle chapels, reminded Knight brothers of their religious vocation. These prayers weren't optional extras, but mandatory observances, with absence requiring confession and penance. The rhythm of prayer punctuated days otherwise filled with warfare and administration. Mass attendance was required, with Knight brothers receiving communion regularly. The Eucharist represented Christ's sacrifice, which the Knights believed they imitated through their willingness to die fighting pagans. This theological connection between crusading warfare and Christian salvation justified their military activities as religiously meritorious. Confession and penance addressed sins. Knight brothers regularly confessed to priest brothers, receiving absolution and assigned penances. Serious violations like cowardice, disobedience, or sexual misconduct could result in harsh punishments, imprisonment, flogging, or expulsion from the order. The cult of the Virgin Mary was particularly emphasized. The order's full name referenced Saint Mary, and churches throughout their territories honored her. Knights wore Mary's image on their shields and invoked her protection before battle. This Marian devotion reflected broader medieval religious trends, while reinforcing the order's distinct identity. Crusading ideology provided theological justification for violence. Medieval Christianity struggled with reconciling Jesus' teachings about peace and love with the necessity of warfare. The crusading movement resolved this tension by defining war against non-Christians as spiritually meritorious, comparable to monastic asceticism in earning salvation. The order believed they served Christ directly by expanding Christianity's territorial reach. Every pagan Prussian or Lithuanian killed or converted represented a soul potentially saved from damnation. This conviction allowed Knight brothers to reconcile their violent activities with Christian morality, viewing warfare as religious service. Relic veneration connected the order to wider Christian traditions. Churches and chapels housed relics of saints, believed to possess miraculous powers. Important relics attracted pilgrims, generated revenues through offerings, and sanctified the order's presence. Possession of significant relics enhanced prestige and demonstrated divine favor. Saints' days and religious festivals structured the calendar. Christmas, Easter, Pentecost, and various saints' feast days provided breaks from routine, occasions for special observances, and opportunities for community celebration. These festivals connected the isolated Ordensstaat to universal Christian temporal rhythms. Heresy was combated vigorously. The order participated in efforts to suppress heretical movements, viewing doctrinal uniformity as essential for social cohesion. Suspected heretics faced investigation, trial, and punishment if convicted. This religious intolerance was typical for medieval Christianity, but reinforced the order's reputation for severity. The order's eventual Protestant transformation represented profound religious rupture. When Albrecht von Brandenburg-Ansbach embraced Lutheran theology, he rejected the entire framework that had justified the order's existence, crusading merit, monastic vows, celibacy, and ecclesiastical authority. This theological revolution made the order's traditional form untenable. The Teutonic Order left permanent marks on the landscape through architectural achievements that still inspire awe centuries after their power ended. These structures embodied their wealth, technical sophistication, and cultural ambitions. Marienburg Castle stands as the Order's supreme architectural achievement. Built gradually from 1274 onwards, continually expanded through the 14th century, the fortress monastery eventually covered vast areas along the Nogat River. Multiple enclosed courtyards, soaring towers, elaborate Gothic halls, and extensive storage facilities created one of medieval Europe's largest castle complexes. The High Castle formed Marienburg's core, housing the convent of Knight Brothers. 4 wings surrounded a central courtyard, containing the chapter house where important decisions were made, the dormitory where brothers slept communally, the refectory where they ate, and the castle church where they prayed. Gothic architecture's vertical emphasis and pointed arches created spaces that were both defensive strongholds and inspiring religious environments. The middle castle contained administrative facilities and the Grand Master's palace. This section housed the bureaucracy governing the entire Ordensstaat, treasurers managing finances, marshals commanding armies, and countless officials administering justice, collecting taxes and maintaining records. The Grand Master's chambers combined defensive strength with luxurious appointments suitable for entertaining visiting dignitaries. The Grand Master's palace represented Gothic architecture's pinnacle. Its summer refectory featured elaborate vaulting supported by a single central column, a technical tour de force demonstrating medieval engineering capabilities. Walls were decorated with sculptures and paintings depicting the Order's history. Large windows provided light while maintaining defensive integrity through careful placement. Defensive features made Marienburg nearly impregnable. Multiple walls, towers at strategic points, water obstacles, and carefully designed entrances created layered defenses. Attackers would face successive barriers, each defended by garrison forces using superior positions. Storage facilities could sustain defenders through lengthy sieges, making direct assault impractical. Beyond Marienburg, the Order constructed dozens of castles throughout Prussia and Livonia. Each fortress controlled surrounding territories, served as administrative centers, and provided refuge during enemy attacks. These castles followed similar architectural principles: brick construction, Gothic styling, combination of military and administrative functions, and carefully chosen strategic positions. Malbork's namesake reveals linguistic evolution. The German Marienburg became Polish Malbork after 1466, illustrating how political changes alter even place names. The castle survives today as a museum and UNESCO World Heritage Site. Though substantially reconstructed after World War II damage, churches throughout the Ordensstaat showcased Gothic architectural principles. St. Mary's Church in Danzig, the cathedral in Königsberg, and countless smaller churches featured pointed arches, ribbed vaulting, flying buttresses, and large stained glass windows. These structures proclaimed Christian dominance over formerly pagan territories while providing spaces for worship and community gathering. Urban planning revealed organizational sophistication. New towns followed systematic layouts, central market squares, grid street patterns, defensive walls with regularly spaced towers, designated areas for different functions. This rationalized urban design contrasted with the organic, haphazard growth typical of older medieval cities. Fortified granaries stored agricultural surpluses and trade goods. These massive brick structures, particularly in Danzig, combined storage capacity with defensive strength. The ability to stockpile grain allowed the Order to weather poor harvests and maintain stable food supplies for urban populations. Bridge construction facilitated communication and commerce. The Order built numerous bridges across Prussian rivers, replacing ferries and fords with permanent stone structures. These engineering projects demonstrated technical expertise while improving economic efficiency through faster, more reliable transportation. Hydraulic engineering controlled water for multiple purposes. Mills ground grain, providing the fundamental technology for flour production. Drainage systems reclaimed marshlands for agriculture, expanding cultivable area. Water-powered trip hammers supported metalworking industries. These hydraulic projects represented sophisticated understanding of water engineering. The architectural legacy survived political changes. Many structures continued serving adapted purposes under Polish, then Prussian, then German rule. Some were destroyed in 20th century conflicts, particularly World War II, but numerous examples survive, allowing modern visitors to appreciate the Order's architectural achievements directly. As our journey through Teutonic history draws to a close, we can reflect on how these warrior monks who began in a hospital tent outside Acre shaped European civilization in ways still visible today. The cities they founded, Königsberg, Danzig, Thorn, Elbing, became major urban centers, though now bearing different names and belonging to different nations. The castles they built remain tourist destinations and historical monuments. The agricultural systems they introduced transformed wilderness into productive farmland. The trade networks they participated in laid foundations for later commercial development. Yet the human costs were staggering. The Prussian tribes disappeared as distinct peoples, absorbed through conquest, conversion, and assimilation. Decades of warfare between the Order and Lithuania devastated populations on both sides. The eventual conflicts with Poland brought suffering to countless civilians caught between opposing armies. The Teutonic Knights exemplified medieval crusading ideology in its purest form, a fusion of religious devotion and martial prowess, directed toward expanding Christianity's territorial reach. Their ultimate failure revealed the limitations of this ideology when confronted with political realities, economic challenges, and changing religious circumstances. Their story reminds us that institutions, no matter how powerful, must adapt to survive. The Order's inability to evolve beyond crusading when that mission became obsolete doomed them to irrelevance. Organizations that cannot or will not change with their times face extinction, regardless of past achievements or present resources. The Teutonic Order's legacy remains contested. For some, they represent heroic defenders of Christian Europe, brave warriors who tamed pagan wilderness. For others, they embody brutal colonialism, religious intolerance, and cultural destruction. Historical truth encompasses both perspectives. They were complex people operating within their era's ideological frameworks, sometimes noble, often brutal, always human. As you drift toward sleep, perhaps you'll dream of castle towers rising above dark forests, of knight brothers chanting vespers in candlelit chapels, of merchants haggling in Hanseatic ports, of battles fought in snow-covered fields. These images, though distant by centuries, connect us to a medieval world where faith and violence intertwined, where ambition and devotion coexisted, where human beings struggled, achieved, and ultimately passed into history. The Teutonic Knights are gone, their military power dissolved, their territorial state vanished. But echoes remain, in architecture, in place names, in historical memory, in the landscapes they shaped. Their story, for all its violence and tragedy, forms part of our collective human heritage, a reminder of how faith can inspire both great achievements and terrible suffering, how organizations rise and fall, and how history's currents sweep away even the mightiest institutions when their time has passed. Rest now, as the medieval world fades back into the past, and let the rise and fall of the Teutonic Order accompany you gently into dreams.